Hey, what are you doing here?
Just loading my groceries.
How long you been standing by this car?
Couple minutes, I just came out.
Do you live around here?
I'm visiting.
All right, turn around for me.
Am I being detained?
Turn around.
Before you do that, I need you to see something.
He was loading eggs and bread into his trunk when a police officer decided something felt wrong. And that feeling alone set off a chain reaction no one could stop. If you blinked, you would miss the moment everything went wrong. A carton of eggs slid too close to the edge of a paper bag, and Alonzo Pierce reached out to steady it. That small motion, nothing more than a reflex, happened at the exact second someone across the parking lot decided he didn't like the way Alonzo looked standing next to his own car. "Come on, don't tear now," Alonzo muttered, tightening his grip on the bag handle as the paper strained. The parking lot outside a grocery store in Tempe, Arizona, baked under the afternoon sun. Heat shimmered above the asphalt. Carts rattled. Engines turned over. People moved in lazy lines between cars, focused on dinner plans and errands, not on the man quietly loading groceries into a dark gray sedan near the far end of the lot. Alonzo worked carefully. Eggs first, bread on top. He always did it this way. He'd learned a long time ago that rushing made things messy. "Hey, sir!" The voice cut across the space behind him. Alonzo paused, one hand still inside the trunk. He didn't turn right away. People talked to each other all the time in parking lots. Sometimes they asked for directions. Sometimes they needed a cart. "Sir, I'm talking to you." This time, the voice carried weight. Authority. Not loud, but sharp enough to scrape. Alonzo turned. A uniformed police officer stood a few steps away, one hand resting near his belt. His name tag read, Trevor Malloy. Sunglasses hid his eyes, but his posture said he'd already decided how this conversation would go. "Yes?" Alonzo said. Calm. Neutral. "What's going on here?" Malloy asked. Alonzo glanced down at the open trunk, then back up. "I'm loading groceries." Malloy tilted his head, like he was inspecting something off-center. "You been sitting here a while?" "I just came out," Alonzo replied. "Receipt's in the bag if you want to see it." Malloy didn't reach for the receipt. He took one slow step closer. "You live around here?" Alonzo felt it then. Not fear, not anger. Awareness. The kind that made the muscles between his shoulders tighten. "I'm visiting," he said. Malloy's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Visiting who?" "That's not really relevant, is it?" Alonzo asked, still even, still controlled. A woman pushing a cart slowed nearby. A man loading cases of water glanced over, then tried not to stare. Malloy shifted his weight. "I'm asking the questions right now." "Okay," Alonzo said. "Am I being detained?" Malloy's jaw set. "You don't get to ask that." Alonzo closed the trunk gently, careful not to slam it. "I'm just trying to understand why I'm being stopped." Malloy stepped closer again. Too close. "You're being stopped because I say so." The heat pressed harder. Alonzo could hear his own breathing now. Slow. Measured. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said. Malloy's hand moved higher on his belt. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." That was when phones started coming out. A teenager leaned against a minivan, pretending to text. An older man paused mid-step, keys dangling from his fingers. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" Alonzo didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He turned and placed his palms flat against the trunk. "Why am I being detained?" he asked again. Malloy ignored the question. "Spread your feet." Alonzo did. A grocery bag tipped inside the trunk, apples rolling out and thudding onto the pavement. One split open, juice streaking across the asphalt. Malloy snapped cuffs onto Alonzo's wrists. "You're under arrest for obstruction," he said. "That doesn't make sense," Alonzo replied, his voice steady but tight now. "I've complied with everything you asked." Malloy leaned in close. "You should have stayed quiet." As Alonzo was guided toward the patrol car, he caught his reflection in the sedan's window. Hands cuffed. Hoodie wrinkled. Groceries scattered behind him like evidence of something gone terribly sideways. Across the lot, a woman shook her head. Someone else said, "This ain't right." Alonzo knew something they didn't. He knew how bad this was about to get. But even he couldn't see how far it would go. But what looked like a routine stop was already pulling in witnesses, cameras, and consequences that couldn't be undone. The back door of the patrol car shut with a hollow thud that echoed louder than it should have. Alonzo sat upright, wrists tight in cuffs, staring through the wire screen toward the front windshield. The air inside the car felt thicker, heavier, like it didn't move at all. Outside, Malloy spoke into his radio, voice low, clipped, choosing words carefully but not kindly. "Yeah, I've got one male detained," Malloy said. "Possible obstruction." Alonzo leaned forward as much as the cuffs allowed. "Officer, I'd like to know what I'm being charged with." Malloy didn't turn around. "I already told you." "You didn't," Alonzo replied. "You said obstruction. Obstructing what exactly?" Malloy opened the driver's door and slid into his seat. The car rocked slightly. He adjusted the mirror, finally meeting Alonzo's eyes through the glass. "You were being evasive," Malloy said. "Refused to answer basic questions." "I answered every question you asked," Alonzo said. "I asked if I was being detained. That's not a crime." Malloy started the engine. "You don't get to dictate how a stop goes." They pulled out of the parking lot. Alonzo watched the grocery store fade behind them, the apples still sitting where they had rolled. A woman stood near his car, phone still raised, filming until the patrol car disappeared down the road. The ride to the station was quiet at first. Just the sound of tires on pavement and the radio murmuring codes Alonzo knew by heart but pretended not to understand. "You got ID on you?" Malloy asked. "Yes." "Why didn't you hand it over when I asked?" "You never asked," Alonzo said. "You asked why I was there." Malloy exhaled sharply through his nose. "You always this difficult?" Alonzo shook his head slowly. "I'm always calm." Malloy laughed once, not amused. Funny way of showing it. They stopped at a light in Mesa, Arizona. A pickup truck pulled up alongside them. The driver glanced over, noticed Alonzo in the back seat, then looked forward again, uncomfortable. Alonzo spoke carefully. "I want a supervisor." Malloy's hands tightened on the wheel. "You'll get one when we get there." "And I want to make a phone call." Malloy didn't answer. The station smelled like old coffee and cleaning spray. Malloy opened the back door and guided Alonzo inside, one hand firm on his arm. Not rough, not gentle either, just enough to remind him who was in control. At the front desk, a clerk looked up. "What have we got?" "Obstruction," Malloy said again. The clerk glanced at Alonzo. "You want medical?" "No," Alonzo replied. "I want a supervisor and a phone." The clerk hesitated, eyes flicking to Malloy. "Put him in holding," Malloy said. The holding room was small. Cold bench, gray walls, no clock. Alonzo sat down, finally allowed to rest his shoulders. He took a slow breath in through his nose, then out. He replayed the parking lot in his mind. The questions, the tone, the way everything shifted the moment he asked a legal question. The door opened again. A different officer stepped in, younger, eyes uncertain. "You Pierce?" the officer asked. "Yes." "You say you want to make a call?" "Yes." The officer uncuffed one wrist just enough to pass him a phone. "You got one call." Alonzo didn't hesitate. He dialed a number he hoped he wouldn't need today. It rang twice. "Pierce!" a voice answered. Alonzo kept his voice low. "I've been detained by local police. Mesa Station." Silence, sir. Then, "Are you secure?" "I'm fine," Alonzo said. "But this needs to be handled fast." "Stay where you are," the voice replied. "We're making calls." The phone was taken back. The cuffs went on again. Minutes passed. Then voices outside the room. Quieter. Tighter. A door opened and closed. Footsteps paced. Finally, the holding room door swung open. A sergeant stood there, face tight, eyes wide with something close to panic. "Mr. Pierce," he said carefully, "there's been a misunderstanding." Alonzo stood. "That's one word for it." The sergeant swallowed. "You're being released immediately." Malloy stood behind him, arms crossed, jaw rigid. Alonzo met his eyes. "This didn't have to happen." Malloy looked away. Alonzo walked out of the station, a free man, but the air felt different now. He could already sense it. This wasn't ending here. But while the cuffs were off, the damage had already started spreading beyond the walls of that station. By the time Alonzo reached the curb outside the station, his phone was already vibrating in his pocket. He didn't check it right away. He stood there instead, letting the sun hit his face, listening to traffic pass like nothing had happened. The world hadn't stopped. It never did. But something had shifted. When he finally looked, the screen told the story before any words could. Missed calls, texts stacked on top of each other. A short message from a colleague read, "You seen the video yet?" Alonzo's stomach tightened. He opened the link. The footage started shaky. Too close. Too fast. Someone breathing hard behind the camera. "Why you doing this to him?" a woman's voice said off-screen. The angle widened. There he was, hands on the trunk, hood up, Malloy's arm moving into frame. "Put your hands behind your back," Malloy's voice barked. The camera dipped just as the cuffs snapped shut. "Oh my God," someone said. Apples rolling across the pavement, one splitting open. The sound was small, but it landed like a punch. Alonzo closed his eyes for a second, then watched the rest. The patrol car, the door slamming, the filmer whispering, he was just loading groceries. The clip ended. Another one started right away. Different angle, clearer audio. "You can't just do this," a man said. "What did he do?" Malloy's reply came sharp. "Back up or you'll be next." Alonzo lowered the phone. Inside the station, Malloy paced near the front desk, pretending not to notice the looks coming his way. A dispatcher whispered to another clerk. Someone closed an office door that usually stayed open. Outside, Alonzo walked to his car. The groceries were gone. Someone had placed them neatly back into bags and set them on the hood. A note rested on top, written in looping pen. "Didn't feel right leaving this." He sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine. He watched another notification pop up, then another, and another. The video was moving fast, not just one clip. 3, 5, 10. Different phones, different angles. Same moment. A local news station posted it with a headline that made his jaw clench. "Man arrested during grocery stop sparks questions." Questions. That word did a lot of work. His phone rang. A number he recognized but didn't save. "Alonzo?" said Caleb Rowan, his handler. "You okay?" "I am," Alonzo said. "But this is getting out." Caleb exhaled slowly. "Yeah, we're tracking it." "Malloy didn't know who I was," Alonzo said. "But he didn't need to." There was a pause. "We agree." That evening, Alonzo sat in a hotel room in Scottsdale, Arizona, curtains half drawn, television muted. The footage looped on every channel. Commentators argued. A former officer shook his head and said the stop made no sense. A local activist pointed to the apples on the ground and said, "This could have been anyone." Someone else said, "It's always someone." Alonzo muted it all. He called his sister. "They put you in cuffs?" she asked, voice tight. "Yes." "For nothing?" "Yes." She went quiet. Then, "I saw the video." So did a lot of people. The next morning, the department released a short statement. Words chosen carefully. No admission. No apology. Just a promise to review. Malloy didn't appear in public. His social media vanished. His neighbors told reporters he was a good guy. A coworker said he followed procedure. Procedure didn't explain the tone, or the timing, or the cuffs. By noon, a civil rights attorney named Janelle Rourke left Alonzo a voicemail. "We should talk," she said. "Today." They met at a small office near Chandler. Janelle slid a tablet across the desk. "Look at this," she said. It was another clip, slower, zoomed in. Malloy's hand resting near his belt before he spoke a word. "That's the moment," Janelle said. "That's where it turned." Alonzo nodded. He decided before he asked anything. Janelle leaned back. "This is bigger than one stop." Outside the office, a small group of people stood with signs. No shouting, just quiet faces. One read, "Loading groceries is not a crime." Alonzo watched them through the glass. He hadn't planned on being a symbol. He hadn't planned on being known, but he understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped in that parking lot. This wasn't about him anymore, but while the city tried to control the story, the truth was already walking on its own. The meeting room on the second floor of the Mesa Police Department felt smaller than it looked. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A long table sat in the center, scarred with old scratches and coffee rings. At one end, Deputy Chief Roland Keene rubbed his temples while a city attorney scrolled through a tablet beside him. "This is already past containment," the attorney said. "We're trending statewide." Keene didn't respond. He stared at a paused video frame on the wall-mounted screen. Alonzo's hands on the trunk. Malloy's body angled forward. The moment before, everything tipped. Across the table, Trevor Malloy sat stiff-backed, arms folded, eyes locked on the floor. "You want to explain why you made the stop?" Keene asked. Malloy cleared his throat. "Suspicious behavior." Keene looked up. "Spell that out." "He lingered by the vehicle," Malloy said. "Kept questioning me." The attorney tapped the tablet. "Questioning you is not illegal." Malloy's jaw worked. "It raised concerns." Keene leaned forward. "Concerns about what?" Malloy hesitated, just a beat too long. "Say it," Keene pressed. Malloy shook his head. "I followed procedure." The attorney sighed. "Your body cam contradicts that." Malloy's eyes snapped up. "It was a lawful stop." "Then why does the report say obstruction without listing a single obstructive act?" Keene asked. Silence settled over the room. Down the hall, another door closed softly. Two internal affairs officers stood over a desk, listening to radio logs. One rewound a segment and pointed. "Right here," she said. "No call, no bolo, nothing." Her partner frowned. "So why was he watching that lot in the first place?" "Good question." Back in the conference room, Keene stood. "Trevor, you're being placed on administrative leave pending review." Malloy shot to his feet. "You're throwing me under the bus." Keene's voice stayed low. "You drove it there." Across town, Alonzo sat in Janelle Rourke's office again, this time with documents spread across the table. "This isn't just about the arrest," Janelle said. "It's about pattern." She slid one file toward him, then another, then a third. Stops logged late at night. No citations, no arrests. Just questions, detentions, releases. "All Malloy?" Alonzo asked. "Yes," Janelle said. "And everyone ends the same way." Alonzo scanned the pages. "No discipline?" "Correct." He leaned back. "So the city knew." Janelle didn't answer directly. They had opportunities. That afternoon, a city council member requested a closed briefing. Another demanded a public statement. The mayor's office drafted 3 versions of the same apology and couldn't agree on any of them. A spokesperson stood at a podium and said, "We take this matter seriously." Reporters shouted questions. Was the stop racially motivated? Why wasn't the officer disciplined before? Who approved this arrest? No one answered. Malloy sat alone in his car in a driveway in Gilbert, Arizona, staring at his phone. Messages flooded in. Some angry, some supportive. One from a coworker read, "Lay low." He slammed the phone face down on the seat. Back at the station, Keene met with the city attorney again. "We need to settle," the attorney said. Keene frowned. "Already?" "This goes federal if we don't," the attorney replied. "And if it goes federal, discovery gets ugly." Keene exhaled. How bad? The attorney tilted the tablet so Keene could see a headline forming. Undercover federal agent wrongfully arrested. Keene closed his eyes. That evening, Alonzo walked along a quiet sidewalk near his hotel. He watched people pass him without recognition. Couples, joggers, someone walking a dog. Janelle called. They're talking settlement. Alonzo stopped. Already? Yes. And reforms? They're mentioning training. Oversight. Alonzo stared at the pavement. Mentioning isn't enough. I know, Janelle said, but pressure is building. Alonzo looked up at the darkening sky. He thought about the parking lot, the apples, the cuffs. He hadn't wanted this fight, but it had found him anyway. But while city leaders argued in private rooms, the public was still watching and waiting. By sunrise, the video had a life of its own. It wasn't just locals sharing it anymore. It jumped from group chats to national feeds, from neighborhood pages to primetime panels. Every repost came with a new caption, a new argument, a new opinion layered on top of the same few minutes in that parking lot. Alonzo woke to his phone ringing non-stop. Sir, this is Channel 7. Can we get a statement? Alonzo, this is a producer from a national morning show. Mr. Pierce, do you fear retaliation? He silenced the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees. The room felt smaller than it had the night before. He hadn't planned on being recognized. He hadn't planned on his face freezing on screens across the country. Down at the station, the mood was worse. Malloy's locker sat untouched. His name strip had been removed from the duty board. Officers spoke in half sentences, glancing over shoulders. A few shook their heads. Others said nothing at all. In a break room, 2 officers watched a news clip on mute. They slowed it down, one said. Frame by frame. Yeah, the other replied. Hard to argue with that. A reporter stood outside the station fence, microphone raised. We're learning this may not be the first time Officer Trevor Malloy has been accused of improper stops. Inside City Hall, phones rang off the hook. Emails stacked up faster than anyone could answer. The mayor's chief of staff paced a narrow hallway, whispering into a headset. Pull the old complaints, she said. All of them. The complaints told a story no one wanted to read out loud. Stops without cause. People released without charges. Language that danced around explanations but never landed on one. Each incident brushed aside as isolated. Each one easier to ignore than the last. Until now. Janelle Rourke sat across from Alonzo again, this time with a legal pad filled edge to edge. They're trying to frame this as a misunderstanding, she said. Alonzo leaned back. It wasn't. No, Janelle agreed. And the pattern kills that argument. She tapped the pad. We file in federal court. Civil rights. Unlawful detention. Reputational damage. Alonzo nodded. Do it. Outside her office, a small crowd had gathered again. Bigger than before. Someone held a sign that read, I load groceries too. A man stepped forward when Alonzo came out. I got stopped like that once, he said quietly. Nobody believed me. Alonzo met his eyes. I believe you. That night, a press conference finally happened. A city spokesperson stood stiff behind a podium. We acknowledge the seriousness of this situation. A reporter shouted, Is the officer fired? We cannot comment on personnel matters. Another voice cut in. Why were prior complaints ignored? The spokesperson's lips tightened. We are reviewing internal procedures. At the same time, Malloy sat in his living room, television glowing. His name scrolled across the screen beneath a still image from the video. He turned it off and stared at the blank reflection. His phone buzzed. A message from his brother read, Call me. Malloy didn't. Across town, Alonzo finally agreed to one interview. Just one. The journalist sat across from him, hands folded. Why do you think this happened? Alonzo thought for a moment. Because someone made a decision before asking a question. Do you hate the police? She asked. No, Alonzo said. I hate bad decisions that hurt people. The clip aired that evening. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It just sat there, calm and firm. Public reaction shifted. Support poured in. So did scrutiny. The city council announced an emergency session. Advocacy groups demanded timelines. Federal oversight was whispered about in official circles. Behind closed doors, settlement numbers were floated. Then raised again. Janelle called Alonzo late. "They're serious now." "How serious?" "Enough to change policy on paper," she said. "Maybe more if we push." Alonzo looked out the hotel window at passing headlights. "We push." He knew the cost wouldn't just be money. It would be trust, reputation, careers, maybe futures. But the cost of doing nothing had already been paid too many times. But as pressure tightened from every direction, the city faced a choice it could no longer delay. The conference room at City Hall felt heavier than the one at the police department. No screens this time. No looping footage. Just papers, water glasses, and people who looked like they hadn't slept much. The city attorney cleared her throat and slid a document across the table. "We're prepared to settle," she said. Janelle Rourke didn't reach for it right away. "State the terms." $2 million, the attorney replied. "Paid by the city. No admission of wrongdoing. Policy revisions and mandatory oversight." Alonzo Pierce sat back in his chair, arms crossed. He listened without interrupting. He'd learned that silence made people talk more. "What kind of oversight?" Janelle asked. "Independent review of stops," the attorney said. "Body camera audits, revised training protocols." Alonzo leaned forward. "And Officer Malloy?" The attorney hesitated. "He's no longer on patrol." "That's not an answer," Alonzo said. The attorney met his eyes. "He resigned." The word landed quietly. Outside the room, a small group of reporters waited. Inside, pens scratched paper. The agreement took shape line by line. Later that afternoon, Janelle walked beside Alonzo down the steps of City Hall. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. "Why settle?" someone shouted. Alonzo stopped and turned. "Because what happened shouldn't happen again," another voice called out. "Is money enough?" Alonzo shook his head. "Money doesn't fix trust." The settlement was announced before sunset. Headlines rolled in fast. City to pay $2 million after wrongful arrest. Some cheered, others scoffed. A few asked why it took public pressure to force change. At the police department, a memo went out. New rules, new checklists, new language meant to prevent old habits. Some officers welcomed it. Others bristled. One rookie read the memo twice and said, "This makes sense." A veteran folded it and muttered, "About time." Malloy packed his locker in silence. No ceremony. No send-off. Just a cardboard box and a walk past familiar faces who didn't quite know where to look. At a grocery store parking lot in Tempe, apples were restocked. New crates rolled in. Shoppers came and went, unaware of how much that stretch of asphalt had cost a city. Alonzo returned home days later. He stood in his own kitchen, unloading groceries from his car. Eggs, bread, apples. He paused for a moment, hands resting on the counter. The call from his handler came that evening. "You're clear to resume work," the voice said. Alonzo considered it. "I will, but not right away." "Understood," the voice replied. He sat down and watched the sun drop through his window. He thought about the people who had stopped him outside Janelle's office. The ones who said it happened to them too. The ones without videos, without lawyers, without calls that got answered. That thought stayed with him. A week later, Alonzo stood at a community forum in Peoria, Arizona. No cameras, no suits, just folding chairs and people who wanted to talk. A man raised his hand. "What do we do when this happens to us?" Alonzo answered honestly. "You speak, you document, and you don't let anyone tell you it didn't matter." A woman asked, "Do you think things will really change?" Alonzo didn't rush his reply. Change doesn't come from one settlement. It comes from people refusing to accept silence. The room stayed quiet for a beat. Then someone clapped. Others followed. Later, alone again, Alonzo thought back to the parking lot. How fast it had all happened. How ordinary it had felt until it wasn't. One decision, one moment, one set of cuffs. He knew the city would move on. News cycles always did, but policies were now written. Eyes were open wider than before. That mattered. Before turning out the light, Alonzo left one message on his social feed. Simple. Direct. Pay attention. Ask questions. Record what you see. Accountability only works if we demand it together. If this story made you feel something, don't scroll past it. Share it. Talk about it. And the next time you see something that doesn't sit right, trust that instinct and speak up.